Tonight, an Oklahoma City Council member with white nationalist ties could be voted out of a job in any moment. This man, Judd Blevins, once marched with neo-Nazis and allegedly recruited for white nationalists. Now he's facing a recall when the polls close in just moments. Ed Lavandera is out front in Enid, Oklahoma tonight.
When neo-Nazis and white nationalist hate groups marched through Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, this man named Judd Blevins from Oklahoma was in the crowd. He says he was there to protest the removal of Confederate statues.
You will not replace us!
Blevins returned to Oklahoma, where the monitoring group known as Right Wing Watch later reported he worked as a recruiter for a white nationalist group and posted offensive comments in an online discussion forum. He has since said he disavows these messages. Then last year, Blevins was elected to the city council in Enid, Oklahoma. 808 people voted. Blevins won by 36 votes. Blevins' past had mostly flown under the radar.
Let's go!
Until a small group of progressive activists in Enid sounded the alarm about Blevins joining the Charlottesville March. They're trying to get him voted off the council.
It was very, very disturbing and frightening, and I thought, how is this still happening in this year?
Christy Balden volunteers with the Enid Social Justice Committee, which organized a recall drive. Today, voters will decide if Blevins keeps his city council seat.
We want to hit as many doors, as many addresses as we can, efficiently and politely. Get everybody out to vote.
These volunteers are asking residents to vote for the other candidate on the ballot, Cheryl Patterson. But they're finding not all voters are turning against Blevins, who is a Marine veteran and is fighting to keep his council seat.
He does have supporters in Enid, and that's the really frightening part.
There's real tension around this case.
Yes, there really is.
Thank you.
I will stand before the voters of Ward 1, and I will defend the job I've done here.
Blevins makes it hard to know where he stands, at times apologetic, at other times defiant. He denies identifying as a white nationalist or a white supremacist, but has also asked for forgiveness.
I am a different man today than I was yesterday, and there is no hate in my heart.
That hasn't convinced the city's conservative leadership. They tried to censor him last fall for his failure to apologize and explain his connections to white nationalism, saying his statements have caused disruption and discontent in the city. Judd Blevins declined to speak with CNN, but he's tried to distance himself from white nationalist organizations.
And if I've offended anyone in here, then I ask to be forgiven.
That speech led to this extraordinary moment with the only black city council member, Derwin Norwood.
And I want to do one thing before we quit. Can you stand up? Do you love me?
Yes, I do, as a brother in Christ.
I love you too. I forgive you.
Thank you.
Up until that moment, I struggled with it. But I forgave him. And I realized that in forgiving him, I freed myself from becoming what he was or still may be.
Blevins has tried to disavow his controversial history, but he's also tried to justify his past actions, raising questions about whether he's truly changed.
But I'm not going to play this game where I take things that the media says are problems from America's past that are no longer problems today and pretend like they're serious issues. They're not.
When you heard that, what did you think?
He doesn't understand what he's saying. Our last council meeting, I looked at him just like I'm looking at you. And I said, man, do you realize it was a nigga that put his blood and reputation out there on the line for you?
Frankly, pushing back on this anti-white hatred that is so common in media and entertainment.
If someone's like that in their private life, do they have any business serving in a government position?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because we gave an oath. We raised our right hand. And we swore to the people that we would serve everyone equally and rightfully.
So polls here are closing in just about 2 minutes, and so we expect to have the election results later this evening. Ironically, there's actually a city council meeting going on in the building behind me, but Judd Blevins is not here tonight. Aaron?
Absolutely fascinating, incredible report. Thank you so much, Ed. And thanks to all of you for being with us for that and for our show tonight. Let's hand it off now to AC 360 with Anderson.
We know who the nominees are going to be this November, but the primaries are still going on through June. And tonight, some Democratic Wisconsin voters are using their ballots to send a message to President Biden. Their point is that the president's support for Israel is no longer okay as the crisis in Gaza grows worse by the day. Joining me now is Palestinian-American Layla El-Abed. She's the co-chair of the Uncommitted National Movement. She's also the sister of Democratic Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib of Michigan. Layla, thanks for joining us. Again, you urged Wisconsin voters ahead of today's primary to take a cue from your home state of Michigan, where Uncommitted got a pretty big vote, about 100,000 votes. We're just now starting to see some of the votes coming in Wisconsin. It's not quite at that level, about 9.5%, a little over half of the precincts reporting. But I wonder, at this point, past Michigan and some of the states, Minnesota, where this movement is likely to be the most prominent, what are you hoping to accomplish ahead of November?
What we're hoping to accomplish is an opportunity to continue pressuring President Biden and his administration that he needs to listen to his core constituency now in order to save his presidency and the White House come November. And we plan to take that pressure into the DNC with the delegates that we've won in states including Michigan, Minnesota, Washington State, other states that the uncommitted movement did not have a didn't directly support, but including Wisconsin when those numbers come out.
We did see, I mean, to your point about pressure, the administration has shifted. They've called now for, they're using the word ceasefire to begin with. They're calling for alternatives to a full ground invasion of Rafah. They are issuing pretty strongly worded statements, even tonight, President Biden making it clear that he holds Israel responsible for failing to protect civilians there. Do you see the pressure having an effect at this point?
I do feel that the uncommitted movement and the states that have had very strong protest votes have had a direct impact on the language shift. And this has been a direct result of all of these campaigns, but words are not enough. We need a policy change, a lasting ceasefire, and an end to funding war and occupation against the Palestinian people. And to me, this is not a messaging problem. This is a funding bombs problem.
Layla El-Abed, thank you very much for joining us with that update. And I want to bring in now CNN political commentator and former White House communications director for the Trump administration, Alyssa Farah-Griffin, also senior reporter for The Root, Jessica Washington, and editor-at-large for Reason, as well as co-host of The Fifth Column, Matt Welch. Alyssa, a couple things have been happening tonight. It's been a pretty busy night. Normally, the White House will hold an iftar dinner at the White House. Actually, Layla, in the past, has been at that dinner. She was not there tonight. They decided to hold just a smaller one for just staff, and they had a meeting instead. But a doctor, a Palestinian-American doctor who was in attendance, he walked out in protest. He said it was out of respect for his community. Does this give you an indication of how tough this problem is going to be for this White House to solve and how big of an issue it will be electorally?
Listen, Biden, hands down, has an issue with regard to the ongoing war in Gaza. But if I may issue a warning to the Arab American community as an Arab American, they're playing with fire. I understand that hearts are breaking over what's happening in Palestine. That is reasonable. They should speak up. They should use their voices. They should encourage better policies. But this is very quickly becoming a binary choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Donald Trump would not rule out leveling Gaza if he thought that that was the politically savvy thing to do that his supporters wanted to do. He cut aid to the Palestinian Authority when he was the president. So this notion that you would gamble at such a critical time, I think, is incredibly risky. But Joe Biden also needs to be messaging in these communities. He needs to be speaking in Michigan. It's a good place, frankly, to use the former President Barack Obama to try to reach this community.
I mean, it's an important note that you're hearing from a lot of Democrats. They're worried that this is going to have unintended consequences of basically ushering in another Trump term, which would be, in their view, catastrophic for Gazans.
Yeah, no, there are serious concerns about how this is going to play out politically. I think what you're seeing in part, and I've heard this from multiple sources, the administration was unprepared for the amount of ire over this issue, for the amount of people that would feel so strongly about this. I think up until pretty recently, I don't think they saw how big of a political problem this was, how passionately people were feeling about this issue. So I do think this is definitely not going away, even if they had anticipated that earlier on, and we're going to see this continue to play out through the election.
So, Matt, meanwhile, Trump is campaigning Wisconsin and Michigan. I want to play a little bit about what he's been saying might happen if Biden were to win another election.
Well, tonight, Wisconsin sending a message to President Joe Biden that could very well spell trouble come November. As for Donald Trump, well, he's got a message of his own. Plus, the breaking news out of Taiwan. Have you seen the images already? A massive earthquake rattles the island, the strongest quake in nearly quarter a century. A live update in just moments tonight on Laura Coates Live. All right, by now we've all heard about the undecideds, right? But President Biden is facing what may be his most worrying opponent so far in the battleground state of Wisconsin, the uncommitted. They're counting those primary votes as we speak, and now we've got another vocab term to consider, the uninstructed. So far, there are more than 37,000 votes for uninstructed. And even though Biden won easily, 37,000 votes is nothing in a race as tight as this. He said another warning to the president on his handling of Israel's war in Gaza and the risk it poses for his chances at re-election. President Biden even writing a statement that this evening that Israel has, quote, not done enough to protect civilians, and saying he is outraged and heartbroken over the deaths of aid workers from World Central Kitchen in Israeli strike in Gaza. The president changing plans to host a dinner tonight to break the Ramadan fast after pushback from guests who said it would be inappropriate while people are starving in Gaza. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is hammering Joe Biden on immigration using incendiary language like, quote, border bloodbath, and threatening if he doesn't win, this could be the last election in America.
I'm here tonight to declare that Joe Biden's border bloodbath, remember they used the name bloodbath, I was talking about something entirely different, but this is a border bloodbath, ends the day I take the oath of office. If we don't win, this may be the last election our country ever has, and there could be truth to it. That's where we're going, because Joe Biden is a threat to democracy. He's the threat to democracy.
Trump also dangling a promised statement next week on Florida's 6-week abortion ban, which will be on the ballot again in the fall when voters decide on a state constitutional amendment that would protect the right to an abortion in Florida. Now, it's frankly more than fair to wonder why exactly it's going to take him a week to come up with a statement when he's been crowing about the demise of Roe v. Wade for almost 2 years. I mean, he's been taking credit for overturning it every chance he gets. Well, he's saying credit. Democrats are saying that he is responsible. That's a point Democrats aren't letting anyone forget, directly blaming Trump for bans like the one in Florida that President Biden says, quote, are putting the health and lives of millions of women at risk. I want to bring in Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden, and former Republican Congressman Joe Walsh is also here. Welcome to you both. What a night. I mean, it's hard to imagine we are still in this so-called primary season, knowing we have these two candidates at this point. But the third-party candidate really seems to be uncommitted or uninstructed. Megan, to you first. This is a real problem for Biden, and the humanitarian crisis also getting worse. There was a strike on the aid workers just yesterday, and he is getting protested at every event that he has. So how does Biden course correct, if at all?
Look, I think that he definitely needs to take into account what these folks are saying. It's a huge problem for him. This entire conflict is fraught with problems for the administration. There's no question that there needs to be more humanitarian aid done in Gaza. I know, being with him when we were in Poland and working with World Central Kitchen, this is personal to him. He is friends with Jose Andres. We saw the work they were doing firsthand when we were there. It's extremely devastating to have this attack happen, and then for Bibi to not, or for Netanyahu not to take responsibility in a real way or have any sort of remorse or feeling towards this is devastating for the administration.
What did you make of Biden's response and reaction to Netanyahu talking about how he's outraged and heartbroken and that they have not done enough to protect civilians?
I think to what Megan said, Laura, look, this is a bad issue for him. Why? Because he's pro-Israel, but this divides his base. The left is not pro-Israel. Most moderate Democrats are. So it divides his very voting coalition. And Laura, when he tries to play it cautiously down the middle on this issue, he pleases no one. What he needs to do is stand in front of his base and say, I'm pro-Israel, I'm going to listen to your concerns. But Laura, he's going to have to confront his left flank on this issue.
Is saying he's pro-Israel going to solve the problem among his base?
I don't think so. I think the uncommitted is a huge issue, and I think that you need those people to turn out, and you need these people to turn out in these battleground states. Like Michigan has a huge Arab population. Like, you can't isolate all of these folks. I do think it solves some of the issue, but I don't think it solves the problem completely.
I mean, one of the questions people have is, are you uncommitted now but ultimately going to vote for Biden later on? That's the key, turnout, right? Because many people who are uncommitted now aren't going to go for Trump.
Most will. And Trump's got this problem.
Most will what? Turn out?
Most will turn out eventually and vote for. Just like I think most Nikki Haley voters are going to support Trump at the end of the day. Look, this is an angry electorate. We are living in an angry populist moment. Trump's an evil demagogue. Why are people even thinking about RFK Jr.? Because they're looking for something different. Trump feeds this he inflames this anger with bad stuff, but Joe Biden doesn't recognize, Laura, how angry the populace is. He's got to get his arms around that.
Well, if the population is that angry, does the inflammatory rhetoric of Trump as relates to, say, the border, is that feeding the beast?
So I do think he recognizes how angry they are. I just am not sure that his tenor and demeanor and his words is helping the cause, right? Like, people are listening to Trump and people are getting excited and by the incendiary language, and that's just not Joe Biden's style. That's not how he's going to run. He runs a much different. He has more empathy and more compassion for folks, and it comes across when he's campaigning. So I think that it is a challenge for him to connect with folks that are more fired up and more, more incendiary.
But does the rhetoric make people have a visceral reaction such that they will be more inclined to turn out?
Oh, yes. And weirdly, again, everything Trump spouts is cruel and just bigoted BS. And he did it again today, Laura. But it doesn't hurt him. Even a lot of black voters and brown voters are concerned about crime and the border. And even though Trump lies about it, he feeds into it. I agree with Megan. Biden's Biden, but Biden needs to address these issues head on.
I mean, Trump is talking about a woman by the name of Ruby Garcia who was tragically killed, also by an illegal immigrant. Listen to what he had to say on this issue. Now I want to turn to a small town in Oklahoma. Tonight, sending, frankly, a very big message. Voters in Enid giving the boot to a council member with white supremacist ties. His name is Judd Blevins, and he was elected to the city council last year by just 36 votes. And then his past began to get more and more attention. Now, you can see him here. If that scene looks familiar, it's probably because you've seen it before. That's the 2017 Unite the Right rally, where neo-Nazis and white nationalists marched through the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia. Judd says he was protesting the removal of Confederate statues. But it doesn't end there. A monitoring group called Right Wing Watch later reported he was a recruiter for a white nationalist group. It says that he posted offensive messages like these in an online discussion group. Now, once all that began to spread more widely, it led to a push to then recall him from the council. And now he's out, losing to Cheryl Patterson in that recall. As for what Judd says about the accusations, well, It's a bit maybe wishy-washy is the way to describe it at best. He's apologized at times, denying he's a white nationalist, but he's also been defiant and has held his ground on being able to speak freely. He was on the brink of being censored last fall, but that censure was postponed after the only black commissioner on the city council forgave him.
I want to do one thing before we quit. Can you stand up? Do you love me?
Yes, I do, as a brother in Christ.
I love you too. I forgive you.
Thank you.
That commissioner, Derwin Norwood, he joins me now. Derwin, thank you so much for joining me. How are you this evening?
I'm doing great, Laura. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad you're here.
I'm
well, thank you, and I'm glad that you are here. I want to get to that moment of forgiveness that, frankly, I have been replaying in my mind even after seeing it. But first, I do want to ask you about these results. Judd Blevins has been recalled officially. What is your reaction?
Well, it's a blessing to see him relieved. I've gotten to know him a little bit more personally than anyone else on the council. And in confidence, he shared things with me. And I'm aware of the fact that it's bigger than Judd Blevins. It's a national problem that we have had for a long time. And there are citizens in Enid that were brave enough to take it upon themselves to fight back against white supremacy. I felt sorry for Judd, you know, and the conversations that he's had with me privately, I really know how he feels about certain situations and things that have happened that he's not going to share with everyone else. So
why,
he
over the
trusts
course of those conversations, and I'm intrigued by the trusting rapport that you have built, but what about those conversations has made you feel sorry for him?
just the fact that he got caught up. You know, he went to the military, came back to the United States, and during the Trump era, I'm just going to tell the truth tonight. He heard things that inspired him and made him feel that his race was in trouble and he needed to defend and, you know, his heritage more than anything else. He felt the need to defend his heritage.
When you hear that, especially given his military service, you can imagine there are many members of the military who would hear that and think that's anathema to the protection of the values we hold so dear, in spite of the history of, we know, the experience of many black soldiers returning from World War II and beyond. But let me ask you, were you surprised to hear that his military experience was a catalyst?
Yes, absolutely. I was. But, you know, I've had many uncles. My father, he served in the military himself. So I've never been in the military. You know, there's things that happen in the military just like they do in the civilian world that we don't know anything about. And those experiences can change your perception. You know, and they can have effects on you short-term and long-term throughout your life.
Is that what's motivated you to forgive him?
Well, what actually motivated me to forgive him was my upbringing in the Pentecostal Holiness Church, which is the Church of God in Christ. I was trained that all souls belong to God. You know, I read it in God's word. And being a man of God myself, I felt like if I can speak about it or preach on it, I need to live it. So I wanted to be an example for the former commissioner. I wanted to be his example. When I read the life of Apostle Paul, there was a great change that took place. And I believe that God can change anyone if they want to be changed.
Well, I know Kojic very well. Many of my family members in Florida are members of a Church of God in Christ. And I have to ask you, when I'm looking at that moment, the pace of that conversation had me wondering at first, were either of you aware, did he know that you were going to ask him that question about his love for you at that time?
He did not, neither did I.
Really?
When the Spirit of God is moving, you don't have any control, and when those convictions come about, you just have to react. And, being prayerful and believing in fasting, the power of the Holy Ghost, you don't know which way he's going to move you, but when it happens, it happens. So, I wanted God to get the glory in all of this.
Let me ask you, when you look at this, and I have to wonder, given the nature of your relationship that you have explained, you seem to have gotten either closer with him or understood him in a different way. Do you think his ousting from this council is going to trigger him to revert to the beliefs he once had or might still have?
Hopefully not, because the way I look at it, Laura, is the fact that he's an individual. He has a soul. I don't care about his ethnicity, his race, or anything. What I care about is his soul. I want to see true change. And if I can be that individual that can help him along the way, I'm not taking it personal. I feel like I have a mission to do. And that's to help convert individuals who have been deceived.
Have you spoken to him tonight since he was ousted?
No, ma'am. I spoke to him last Friday. And I explained to him that, I have talked to CNN, and I did an interview with him at my father's church, Westside Church of God in Christ. And he thanked me and he said, Derwin, I respect you. And I told him, I said, Judd, when I watched you up on that stage, I felt sorry for you. You were struggling. You were really going through. And when I seen his mother, and she came up to me and she introduced herself to me, it hit me because I could see the pain in her eyes. And he told me, he said, you're absolutely right. This is really hurting my mother. They're humans. We all make mistakes.
What did you understand to be hurting her? The admission from her son or the attention that was being provided?
I believe all of the above. I believe that when I looked at her, no mother wants to see her child suffer.
No, you certainly do not, as any mother would know. Derwin Norwood, thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura, for having me. God bless you.
Thank you. Well, there's a ruling by Florida's Supreme Court now presenting women with a very stark choice, shall we say. Some may have to drive 17 hours to seek abortion-related services. Next, how one clinic all the way in Illinois is trying to help them.
Donald Trump and Joe Biden have been the party's presumptive nominees for weeks now, but there are still primaries taking place across the country tonight, including in the state of New York. The polls are now closed in Rhode Island, where NBC News projects that President Joe Biden is the winner of the Democratic primary, and Donald Trump is the projected winner of the Republican primary. Next door in Connecticut, President Biden has also won handily, as has Donald Trump on the Republican side. Voters in New York and the swing state of Wisconsin also got their chance to vote for the candidates today, as well as a handful of challengers whose names remain on the ballot. Results in both states will start coming in after the top of the hour, but we don't expect any surprises there either. Now, there are more than a dozen states and territories remaining on the primary calendar, but of course, the general campaign's already in full swing. And this week, Joe Biden is putting one key issue front and center: abortion rights. We'll talk more about that next.
We've been following the campaign, and there have been some reports about possible connections with white supremacy. Could you tell us about that? And then Connie pulls out her sign. She goes, so this isn't you. And then his face turned beet red, and he goes, oh, so that's what this is about.
That's Connie Vickers and Nancy Presnall, two of the women who helped spearhead the effort to recall Enid, Oklahoma City Council member Judd Blevins. After discovering a photo of Blevins marching with a tiki torch at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, the two women say they knew they had to do something. Along with the group they formed to recall Blevins, the Enid Social Justice Committee, Vickers and Presnall organized a signature drive that secured hundreds of signatures, which was more than necessary to spark today's recall vote. And now, tonight, thanks to that vote, Judd Blevins is out of the Enid City Council. He will be replaced by Republican Cheryl Patterson. Joining me now is Brandy Zadrozny, NBC News senior reporter, live from the Recall Watch Party in Enid, Oklahoma. Brandy, thank you for just putting this on our radar and also being live on the scene as the results are coming in here. To what degree, can you give us a picture of the sort of the grassroots effort to oust a white supremacist from the city council?
Yeah, I mean, you can take a look around in this room. I am at the watch party of the Enid Social Justice Committee. This is a small group of people who have had a huge effect on their community, especially in terms of white supremacy and extremism. Now, the folks around me are all very different. They have different ideas. Some of them are Democrats. Some of them are very, very progressive leftists. But they've come together. They came together in 2013 when Judd Blevins was elected. Now, we knew a little bit about Judd Blevins' past. Some stuff was on the internet. But these are the folks, like you just showed, Connie and Nancy. These are the folks who really, really just wouldn't let go. They kept going to city council meetings, holding the picture of Judd Blevins up at Unite the Right. They kept having protests. They wouldn't let it go. And now, for me and for all the people here, it just shows the power of what a small group of organized people with a goal can do.
So just to be clear, I think you said 2013, but Blevins has only been in office since 2023, I believe. And Enid is I believe Republicans have a 4-to-1 advantage in voter registration. White grievance is a central plank of the Republican Party platform at this stage. And I wonder from your reporting whether you've gotten a sense that this kind of white supremacy and the great replacement theory that is very much something that Mr. Blevins embraced, whether that actually didn't find favor within the Republican community in Enid, or whether this was largely a Democratic, progressive grassroots effort.
That's the second part of this story that you're not seeing in this room, but very much is a part of this win for progressives here, at least. And it's that they couldn't have done it alone, right? There are conservative Republicans in Eden, including the mayor, including Cheryl Patterson, who just won this seat, who are conservative Republicans, but who could recognize extremism when they saw it and said, this is a bridge too far. We don't want Nazis in our city council, which seems like kind of a low bar, but it's an important line to draw. And it's worth saying that Blevins lost this race. He lost it handily by a 20-point margin, but that still doesn't... 1,400 people voted, right? There was 30-something% of people that still did vote for Blevins, even knowing all of this stuff. So when you talk about white grievance and you talk about the fact that these have mainstream support in the Republican Party, you're not wrong. But again, it does show what can happen when some progressive folks, when Democrats, and when Republicans who can say this is a bridge too far can come together to draw a line.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that this is happening on the same night that Donald Trump in Michigan is calling undocumented migrants animals, suggesting that a whole subsection of the American society are subhuman. And I just wonder, is there any connection towards that sort of poisoned rhetoric and what Blevins stand for, or did they see these things as apples and oranges, the sort of neo-Nazi ties, white supremacists, and the sort of nativist platform upon which Trump is running?
I can only talk right now about Enid, Oklahoma, but in Enid, I've been talking to conservative Republicans at the polls all day. I've been most of the people on the city council are all conservative Republicans. And for those folks, I do think they definitely can draw a line between the things that they saw from this council member who was a white supremacist to the things that they see in mainstream conservative politics. I've talked to a bunch of them about that very thing today. They see here that there's something poisonous in a section of the Republican Party. And at least in Enid, they were able to cut it out.
Well, perhaps Enid will be a bellwether for the broader Republican Party. We will see. Brandy Zadrozny, thank you for your time and great reporting, Brandy. It's great to hear from you. When we come back, with the deaths of 7 aid workers killed by an Israeli airstrike in Gaza, means for the growing humanitarian crisis in the region. That's coming up next.
It's Election Day in Wisconsin. At this hour, with nearly 70% of the vote in, Joe Biden is winning 87% of the Democratic vote, with a little less than 10% of the vote going to uninstructed, which is a protest vote in opposition to the war in Gaza. Donald Trump has 76% of the Republican vote, with more than 13% going to Nikki Haley, who dropped out a month ago, and 4% of the Republican vote going to uninstructed. Unclear about what that is. NBC News is projecting that Joe Biden and Donald Trump have won their respective parties' presidential primaries, which all seems pretty obvious since they are both their parties' presumed nominees at this point. But sometimes you have to say stuff on the record, especially with Trump. And here's just another example of why. Earlier tonight, Donald Trump held a rally in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where he once again spread lies about the 2020 election and claimed that he won the state of Wisconsin.
You know, we won this state. We won the state by a lot. And it came out that we won the state, actually.
He didn't win. It didn't come out that he won. That's just a lie. Donald Trump lost the state of Wisconsin in 2020 to President Biden by more than 20,000 votes. Here's what the Wisconsin Secretary of State, Sarah Godlewski, had to say earlier about the former president's return to her state.
You know, today is the first time Trump has been here in almost 2 years. You know why? He's been too busy focusing on himself, whether that's peddling his next gimmick like buying a Bible or $399 sneakers that just working families can't afford, to, you know, being in court because he has 88 criminal charges against him. And as president, Donald Trump didn't do things for working families here in Wisconsin. Let's talk about his tax plan. You know, his tax plan provided tax breaks for the wealthy 1% in corporations, so the Amazons of the world paid basically zero in taxes. And my parents, who are retired public school teachers, paid more. That's not right. We look at his tax cuts alone, they increased the deficit by almost $2 trillion. That's not fiscally responsible.
Joining us now, Ben Wickler, the chairman of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Ben, good to see you again. Thank you for being with us. What do you make of the results? And obviously not the big headlines that Biden won and Trump won, but what do you make of how this is all playing out, the number of people who came out, the enthusiasm, and the fact that Wisconsin, though Joe Biden won, is a tight place?
Well, it's great to be with you, Ellie, tonight. And it's a big night in Wisconsin. I think the core story is kind of shown with what happened in each party in the election day today. Trump was telling his supporters to wait in line to see him speak, and Democrats were asking people to knock on doors all over the state, which we did. We've knocked on hundreds of thousands of doors, phone calls, relational contacts over the last month, tens of thousands of voters we've reached just today to support local candidates, to get out the vote for President Biden. And then you see the results. The Republican Party is divided. They're still in the middle of a civil war about whether we should be a democracy, about who won in 2020, and whether we should acknowledge reality, about national abortion bans, which Trump is teasing that he's about to announce his support for. We don't know exactly what he's going to say. On the Democratic side, there's a clear call for change in the Middle East, the heartbreaking crisis that we're seeing, and a very clear vote of confidence for President Biden. Democrats want to stop Trump. They want another Biden-Harris term. They want to see progress. And that is what most people want. It's not just hardcore Democrats. Most independents, a lot of Republicans, and almost all Democrats want to see us move forward, protect freedom and democracy, move towards peace and justice, and an economy that works for working people and brings down costs, instead of ransacking the national treasury to hand out huge bags of money to the ultra wealthy, which is the Trump way of doing the economy.
So let's divide those two things up. On the one side of things, the abortion, the freedoms, the liberty, the future of the country, democracy, that whole bucket of things in a tight place like Wisconsin. In fact, since the last election, we have seen on the matter of abortion, it worked out differently in Wisconsin than it did in Michigan because it was a judicial election. But we saw people do the same thing that they did in Michigan. When pressed about the issues of liberty and freedom, they chose liberty and freedom, and Donald Trump's on the wrong side of that one.
That's absolutely right. Everywhere where people have had the chance to go to the ballot box and cast a vote for whether they should make their own decisions about their own bodies or whether politicians should override themselves and their doctors and the choices that they need to be able to make, every time voters vote for freedom. And it's as clear as day. It's as clear as day. And the 2024 election, in some ways, will be a referendum on whether to have a national abortion ban. What the Republicans are putting on the table with Mike Johnson as the Speaker of the House, with these array of MAGA Republicans running for U.S. Senate, including in Wisconsin, Eric Hovde, who last time he ran supported a total abortion ban in 2012, and life begins at conception, the attacks on IVF that we've seen in Alabama. This is what the Republican Party is putting on offer. And on the other side, as President Biden said in his State of the Union address, you elect a Congress that believes in reproductive freedom, that sends him a bill to put the protections of Roe versus Wade back into place. He will sign that bill, and we will defend reproductive freedom coast to coast, nationwide, in Wisconsin and everywhere else. That is the choice that voters have. However they feel about the candidates, they can make a choice about whether they want the power to make their own decisions about their own lives, or they want Republican politicians to override it. And it's as simple as that.
Let me ask you this, because you're not running for office, so I think you're going to give me a more straight answer than people who are in office running for office. 9.3% of people voted uninstructed. That's 31,800 or 32,000 votes already, and we still have more votes to come in. That's more people who went out and said, I'm not going to support Joe Biden. Now, we don't know if that happens in the election, then Democrats won by in the last election. That's a big number. And Michigan was a big number, too. That's enough to sink Democrats in both states if there isn't a better answer than what Biden's come up with so far. Do you worry about that?
Well, the voters who cast ballots in the uninstructed column, they voted in the Democratic primary. So they're Democrats. They know that Trump is not the answer. And they were voting to send a message about change that they want to see, not after the election, but before the election. What they're calling for is what most Americans want, and the president is calling for and working towards, which is an enduring, just peace. That is what people want to see. And when we see the heartbreaking deaths that are happening right now of kids, of aid workers, and the situation with hostages, both for Israel and Palestine, what we need is self-determination and peace and a resolution to the crisis that we see right now. Voters are calling for that change, and they're doing it in the most civic way possible by casting ballots. If you vote in the primary election, you're much more likely to vote in November. So the opportunity now is to create that change, make clear what the values are that the administration, Biden and Harris, are working to advance. And as we see change on the ground, we have the opportunity to come together around that. The contrast will become even clearer with a Trump administration. What they would do in this situation is total disregard for the lives of Palestinian civilians, frankly, for the hostages, for just about anyone else. And that's the contrast that will become more and more clear as we make progress. So this is a call for change. It's a protest vote in the great American tradition of speaking your mind at the ballot box, and it's civic engagement. It's not tuning out from the system. It's getting involved. I think we have a chance to earn all these votes for the Biden-Harris team as we get into November.
Well, I agree with you. I applaud people who will get up and go to the ballot box to make their protest. Ben, great to see you, as always. Thank you, my friend. Ben Wickler is the chairman of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Coming up, the Israeli government is facing widespread condemnation after an airstrike by its military killed 7 aid workers trying to feed the people of Gaza. President Biden said today he is outraged and heartbroken, while one senior UN official said today there is no safe place left in Gaza. We'll go to the region for a live report next.
All right, it is primary night in a handful of states. While it doesn't matter much for delegates for either Biden or Trump, it'll be interesting to see the primary results in the extremely tight swing state of Wisconsin, which is probably going to be very tight again this year, this November. Trump just finished a rally in Green Bay, and our John Huddy is there.
That's
right. Hey, Rob. Yeah. So in 2016, as you know, Trump took Wisconsin. In 2020, it went to Joe Biden by a very, very slim margin, by about 20,600 votes. So they're expecting this to be very, very tight once again. And that tonight is essentially a warm up for November, even though there was a winter storm outside. But former President Trump spoke before a packed convention center here in downtown Green Bay after being in Grand Rapids, Michigan earlier this afternoon. He talked about some of the things that we were expecting him to talk about. He talked about the ongoing border crisis. He talked about trade, the manufacturing, agriculture industries, two huge economic drivers in Wisconsin. So he talked about the ag industry in America, trade with Mexico, trade with China. He talked about the economy. He talked about crime being rampant in America's big cities. And he also talked about debating Joe Biden. Here's what he said about that and the ongoing border crisis. Listen.
We have an empty podium right here to my right. You know what that is? That's for Joe Biden. I'm trying to get him to debate.
So he talked about the podium there, and then he went on to talk about the quote-unquote border bloodbath, referring to the ongoing border crisis under the Biden administration and what we've heard from him before, Biden migrant crime. In the Democratic Party, I want to mention, Rob, one thing we're looking at in that vote is what Democratic organizations and left-wing organizations, a protest vote. They're calling on Democratic voters to vote in the uninstructed delegation on the ballot, kind of the uncommitted. This is a protest against the Biden administration's policies with Israel, the ongoing war in Gaza. So we're kind of focused. We're watching that. We're watching the vote totals. Yeah. We're expecting, of course, former President Trump to win by a hearty margin. The question is by how much, and whether Nikki Haley will take a chunk of that as well, Rob. Back to you.
Okay. John Huddy, thanks so much. Sticking with Wisconsin here for a moment, there's a very important ballot initiative being voted on tonight in the state. The question is simple. Do the voters of Wisconsin want private funds being used in their election process? So this, of course, is how billionaire Mark Zuckerberg was able to dump hundreds of millions of his own dollars into those drop boxes back in 2020, which, of course, solely benefited the Democrat Party when you think about it. Back in 2020, the alleged most secure election in history, Zuckerberg bankrolled $400 million across key states, effectively ensuring a Joe Biden victory. Those drop boxes were put in very strategic locations, most of them in important swing states. Nearly $10 million of that money spread across Wisconsin's blue cities, Madison, Milwaukee, Racine, Kenosha, Green Bay, where Trump spoke tonight. Rob Astorino is the host of Saturday Agenda on Newsmax. He's watching the primaries tonight. This ballot question is pretty important. You wonder how they're gonna go on this.
It's really important. So people don't understand what this is all about. This is about private money going into the administration of elections, which is pure and simple a government job, right? It's supposed to be, with equal representation between Republicans and Democrats to make sure everything is fair. What Zuckerberg did in 2020, he poured, as you said, $400 million. Now let's go into Wisconsin, where they're voting on this tonight. He spent about $10 million in Wisconsin. 85% of that were in those 5 cities you just mentioned. So people are saying, well, what difference does it make? It's getting out the vote. Who could be against democracy and getting out the vote?
Right.
Here's what they do. So let's say these cities like Madison and Milwaukee, okay? Let's get out the vote. We'll have Republicans and Democrats getting out the vote. If there's 100,000, let's just use 100,000, 100,000 Democrats and 10,000 Republicans, and we increase 10% by each, who do you think does real well in that scenario?
Yeah.
Which adds to the total statewide, which helps a candidate win the electoral vote. So this is not about good government. This is about turning out their vote in key areas to win states.
But are they going to be able to get that message, to the voters? I mean, it's, these ballot initiatives, I feel like Republicans don't do well on this.
Normally they don't, and the other big thing is, the Florida potential ballot question you were talking about as well later on this year about abortion and marijuana. And what that would do is, and they're hoping, driving out younger voters who may not vote for Biden now, the suburban women who are not with Biden right now.
They always pull the marijuana thing when they need to win an election. Well, let's legalize pot because we know it'll help us win.
Yeah, well, and when you're stoned, you tend to vote Democrat.
Exactly. Yeah, so, it's a gimmick.
It's totally. Yeah. But, this probably won't affect statewide. Trump is still going to win. It's a red state. But where it will affect down ballot races, congressional races, which are close, local sheriff races, that all matters because that's then the farm team that comes up in the next election. So
when speaking of Florida, you think Florida's still safe?
I think Florida's safe Republican statewide.
Yeah.
But in these congressional races, it might only take 1 or 2 congressional seats to flip nationwide for the House to flip.
Right.
Because they're playing games in New York,
yeah,
where really it came down to last time.
Let's go back to tonight's primaries, which you're going to follow for us here on Newsmax. There's presidential primaries, 4 states. You got Connecticut, Rhode Island that close at 8 o'clock. Wisconsin, New York close at 9 o'clock. You're monitoring the so-called protest votes against Biden this evening. Tell us what that's going to look like.
Well, I mean, most of these states shouldn't have even opened. Nobody's voting. I mean, literally, there's nobody voting because there's no reason to vote other than in some of these states, Democrats might go uncommitted, or what they'll do in New York, for instance, they'll go to vote. They'll say, I want my ballot, but they won't fill it out. They'll put it in the machine. So they voted, they just didn't pick a candidate, and that's kind of your uncommitted.
Okay, we'll follow it. Good to see you, Rob Astorino.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
2 Robs.
That's right.
Good evening, I'm Rob Astorino. So presidential primaries in 4 states this evening: Wisconsin, New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Delaware was scheduled for today, but canceled the primary and awarded the delegates to Biden and Trump. Polls just closed in Connecticut and Rhode Island. Newsmax projects Biden and Trump win the race for Connecticut and Rhode Island. The big question is the amount of uncommitted protest votes against Biden in both of those states. The Badger State is also deciding on whether to ban private money, so-called Zuckerbucks, in the administration of elections. Trump spoke in Green Bay, Wisconsin this evening, rallying voters as they head to the polls. That's where we find senior correspondent John Huddy this evening. John, how is it there in the land of cheese?
It's cold, and there's a winter storm warning despite it being April. And that said, former President Trump nonetheless, though, encouraged people to get out and vote. He spoke in front of a packed standing room only crowd at the convention center here in downtown Green Bay. He talked, as we expected, about the ongoing border crisis, what he calls the border bloodbath. It's a new term that we've heard. He talked about migrant border crime, the influx of illegal migrants, and also the crime committed. Crime running rampant in the big cities. He's talked about also trade with China, trade with Mexico, and debating Joe Biden. Here's what he said about that. Take a look.
We have an empty podium right here to my right. You know what that is? That's for Joe Biden. I'm trying to get him to debate. I'm calling on Crooked Joe to debate anytime, any place. We'll do it anywhere you want, Joe.
And speaking of Joe Biden, in the Democratic primary, we're waiting to see the primary results, specifically the protest vote against Joe Biden that's been launched by various Democratic organizations that are calling for voters to vote in the quote-unquote uninstructed delegation on the ballot. And, of course, we're also, Rob, following the Republican-backed measure to ban the use of private grant money in local elections, dubbed Zuckerbucks. Rob?
All right, John, yeah, that's the whole thing. We're going to see what happens in Wisconsin on those 2 ballot questions. Everything else is basically, pro forma. All right, folks, that's, of course, John Huddy. We'll have more throughout the evening. I'm Rob Astorino. Good evening. I'm Rob Astorino. Polls are closed in 2 states voting today. Delaware canceled its primary and gave the delegates to Trump and Biden. But Newsmax can project that former President Donald Trump will win in Connecticut. Newsmax can also project that Trump will win Rhode Island. Also, we can project it's Joe Biden in Connecticut. The uncommitted vote there is around 12%, though, right now, so that's pretty interesting. Still early. Over to Rhode Island, Newsmax also projects Biden as the winner in the Ocean State. The uncommitted vote is even higher, though, about 17%. In Mississippi's 2nd Congressional District runoff election, Andrew Smith takes on Ronald Eller, and you can see Eller with a big lead early. Whoever wins will take on J6 Committee Chairman Benny Thompson in a heavily Democratic district. In New York, where polls are set to close at the top of the hour, anti-Israel groups who are upset with Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas war, they've been urging voters to submit blank ballots in protest. Correspondent John Glasgow is live in a rainy New York City for us this evening. John, what's the latest?
Hey, Rob. Well, yeah, there's not going to be that the uncommitted portion on the ballot here in New York, as you mentioned, but we could see some blank ballots cast here by voters in New York, and that's in protest of President Biden's handling of the war in Gaza. Now, New York City has been a hotbed here for a lot of these protests that we've seen. They've been disrupting a lot of major events here. Just last week, they tried to interrupt Biden's fundraising campaign event in New York. Earlier today, New York City Mayor Eric Adams cast his vote in the presidential primary, but Adams didn't say who he voted for. Mayor Adams has been critical of the Biden administration and their lack of help here with funding to help his city. Taxpayers are footing the bill for housing and feeding illegal migrants arriving in New York. They've also been multiple crimes involving illegal migrants staying around Times Square. So the other question, will Trump's New York court cases bring out the voters? His first criminal trial starts April 15th as Trump continues to appeal a $500 million fine in his civil fraud case. So it's expected that Trump will win and Biden will win here in New York. The question is whether or not this will be any indication of how the general election will be come November. Back to you, Rob.
All right, correspondent John Glasgow in the Big Apple. Stick around, folks. More election coverage throughout the night. I'm Rob Astorino. Well, good evening. I'm Rob Astorino. Polls are now closed in all 4 of the states voting today. No surprises. Biden and Trump swept Rhode Island and Connecticut, but uncommitted got 17% in the Ocean State, 12% in Connecticut. In New York, Newsmax projects former President Donald Trump as the winner, despite all the legal witch hunts against him. Newsmax can also project that Trump will win the Badger State of Wisconsin. Newsmax also projects President Biden will take New York, despite the anti-Israel crowd submitting blank ballots in protest. And in the Mississippi GOP congressional runoff, Ron Eller beat Andrew Smith. He'll take on J6 Chairman Benny Thompson. Newsmax can also project that Biden is the winner in Wisconsin. All right, for the latest, senior correspondent John Huddy is in Green Bay, Wisconsin. John, what's going on there?
Well, yeah, unsurprisingly, both Biden and Trump have, won their respective primaries. The question, though, is the uninstructed delegation ballot. That is the protest vote by various Democratic organizations against Joe Biden and his handling about Israel and the ongoing war in Gaza and the protest over the war in Gaza by left-wing organizations. How much of a chunk of the vote that uninstructed delegation gets, and also in the Republican GOP primary, how much of a chunk of the vote Nikki Haley gets. She's basically averaged about 15% throughout the primary, so we'll see if she maintains that here in Wisconsin. Former President Trump, though, meanwhile, spoke earlier this evening in a rally before a packed crowd at the convention center. He talked about the quote-unquote border bloodbath, the border crisis under Joe Biden, talked about trade. He also had an empty podium next to his, basically representative of Joe Biden and the calls to basically debate. He also talked about Zuckerbucks, that is the private funding of local elections. Here's what he said about that.
Make sure you vote yes on ballot questions 1 and 2. Do you know what that is? That's ban Zuckerbucks. Ban Zuckerbucks. They put up money.
All right, so the polls just closed. We'll continue to follow the results. But again, Joe Biden, Donald Trump winning their respective primaries. Back to you, Rob.
Senior correspondent John Huddy. More tonight. Stay with us. Good evening. I'm Rob Astorino. Well, polls are now closed in all 4 of the states voting today. Delaware was the 5th, but they canceled the primary and gave it to Biden and Trump. No surprises. Trump and Biden took Rhode Island and Connecticut. But the anti-Biden uncommitted protest vote got 17% in the Ocean State and about 12% in Connecticut. In New York, Newsmax projects former President Donald Trump as the winner, despite all the legal witch hunts against him, Haley getting about 14%. Newsmax can also project that Trump will win in Wisconsin, and you can see 77% for Trump to 14% for Haley. Biden will take New York as well, despite the anti-Israel crowd submitting blank ballots in protest. And in Mississippi, the GOP congressional runoff, Ron Eller beat Andrew Smith, and he'll take on J6 Chairman Benny Thompson in a very Democratic district. Newsmax can also project that Biden is the winner in Wisconsin. Also in Wisconsin, a biggie, voters there no longer allowing the so-called Zuckerbucks. Wisconsin received nearly $10 million from Mark Zuckerberg in 2020. It's close, but it looks like it will win by 2%. For the latest, John Glasgow is in rainy New York City, where anti-Israel voters are protesting Biden with blank ballots. John.
Hey, Rob. Yeah, there's the blank ballot option here, but it's tough to determine how many of those were actually cast because you don't count them if they're blank. So there wasn't an uncommitted option like we saw in some of those other states. And the reason for this, of course, is all of the pro-Palestine protests that we've seen here in New York City. It's been a hotbed here at a lot of multiple events, major events. So the question was, would a lot of people come out and support the president based on what's happening here with the war in Gaza? Clearly, a lot of people are not happy that there hasn't been a ceasefire yet, and they've been trying to get that to happen here when the president is having difficulty getting that happening. We're also watching what's happening with Trump on that side of it because he's got his court cases here in New York City. April 15th, his first criminal trial begins, and he's also appealing that $500 million civil fraud fine, too. So it'll be interesting to see once the final votes are tallied how many people came out for both of the former and current president. Back to you, Rob.
Correspondent John Glasgow from New York City. I'm Rob Astorino.